Good morning and welcome everyone to FSMA Fridays and our topic for today, high-risk food methodology. I'm Barbara Levin. I'll be your host today. Before we begin, let me provide a couple of housekeeping announcements and then we'll jump right into it. If you're having technical issues, you can dial WebEx support directly at 877-509-3239. And for those of you that are listening in as a podcast and perhaps aren't seeing this slide again, that's 877-509-3239. A link to the recording of today's event will be sent via email on Monday. If you're online, you'll be able to submit your questions, and we'll get to those after the pre-submitted questions. And we do have a few folks that sent us some questions from email. I want you to know if you're listening in, I think you were on audio only. We have those, and we'll get those into our Q&A. And if you are online on the visual with us today, for your privacy, you can see the names of the host and presenters and your name only, but not the names of the other attendees. So TGIFS, and we're going to jump right into it. As always, we're really excited to have with us the FSMA Fridays team from the Atchison Group, and today we're welcoming, of course, Dr. David Atchison and Jennifer McIntyre. So David and Jennifer, welcome back to FSMA Fridays. And we're going to just jump right in with you, David, for, as most of you know, we start every FSMA Friday before we get to the topic of the day with just the latest FSMA updates. So David, welcome, and what's FDA up to?
Well, Barbara, I think this is going to be the shortest update since we've been doing FSMA Fridays because the answer is nothing. And now I'll have FDA jumping all over me when you say, what are they doing, and I say nothing. In the context of FSMA, I suspect they're working hard behind the scenes to try to get out a new bite at some of these rules, the animal rule, the produce rule, and the human prevention control rule. But they're not out yet. Maybe they'll come out this week, next week, who knows. But other than that, they've been pretty quiet, and I suspect that's what they're working on. So as soon as they're out, we'll be all over it.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'll tell you, David, that was such a short answer. I'm just gonna keep you on for question two. David, FDA issued a proposed methodology to determine high-risk foods. What's this list going to be used for?
Yeah, you know, when FSMA first came out, there were a lot of people who were just looking at the whole concept of high risk versus low risk. And many of the food companies that I spoke with were saying, how do we get on the low risk? How do we get on the low risk? Because we don't want to be high risk because of what it will do to us. And if you actually try to dissect apart what FDA is going to do with this high risk foods list, the answer is not that much. The one area where they will use it, they will leverage it, is with regard to product tracking. And at least in the statute, it's given the FDA the authority to require more information to be kept with regard to product tracking if you are designated as a high-risk food. They haven't yet said what that will be, but obviously that's something that we've talked about before in terms of what that might mean. So that's probably the most concrete thing. There is also frequency of inspection is supposed to be linked back to high risk. It's you know, in the statute it said if you're high risk every 3 years, if you're non-high risk every 5 years in terms of routine inspections. Not a big difference, but potentially that the risk list would be used to drive in that direction. Another area that it could be used for, and this is something that we really haven't talked about very much because the FDA haven't used it, but it could be worth thinking about, is when FSMA was signed into law in 2011, one of the authorities FDA has is to require certificates for high-risk foods coming into the United States. They haven't leveraged that because they really haven't set up the process for issuing those certificates and setting up the process for the standards for those certificates. But the standards are really going to be the FSMA standards that we've been talking about for months. The process is going to be through the third-party audit process. They're the one who are going to be able to issue the certificates, the accredited auditors, but as we all know, that system isn't in place yet. So I suspect this high-risk list may get used for that too, in terms of determining if you require a certificate for imports. That could be quite burdensome in terms of being on this list that goes beyond product tracking. So I think short answer to the question, Barbara, is it will certainly be used for information for product tracking, and there are 2 or 3 other areas that I've just touched on where I think this high-risk list will play into some actions we'll see from FDA. So that's my thoughts on that one.
Thank you, David. Jennifer, welcome. We're going to come to you with this next question. I think everybody's wondering then, so what are the factors that are going to determine if a food is high risk?
Sure, thanks, Barbara. Well, as David mentioned, this is being put out under the area of FSMA related to traceability. And within FSMA itself, FSMA lays out some of the factors that FDA needs to consider when determining if a food is high risk. And they relate primarily to the association with outbreaks, the likelihood of contamination, the processing that may occur. And so as FDA reviewed this and put their methodology together, a more detailed proposed methodology on how the agency would like to determine if a food is high risk, they came up with 7 factors that they would consider. And those 7 factors are the frequency of outbreaks and the occurrence of illness since 1998, the severity of those illnesses, the likelihood of contamination, and they would be looking at things like frequency of recalls, reportable food registry notices. The 4th is the growth potential of that food. Can it support the growth of these pathogens? And combined with the shelf life of the food, is there enough time for a pathogen to grow? The 5th is there an opportunity during processing for the product to either become contaminated or for processing to have a positive effect and mitigate whatever that risk is. The 6th is related to consumption. How much do people actually eat of this food? What % of the population eats this food? And the 7th is economic impact. And so many of these are interrelated. FDA has said that they'll be looking at micro risks and chemical risks really on a per hazard basis. So they'll be looking at each food, figuring out if there are multiple micro risks, multiple chemical risks, kind of doing this analysis separately. But those are, in broad terms, those are the factors. We'll talk a little bit more in a minute about, the nuts and bolts of how do you actually do this then.
Okay, well then let's go on to that. So Jennifer, how will each one of these factors be scored? And where is the line going to be drawn between those high and not high risk foods?
So FDA in the proposed method did put out their thoughts on how these factors could be scored. And basically for each of the 7 factors that I just mentioned, a food hazard pair would be scored really on a 1 to 9 scale. 1 if the risk was low, 3 if it was medium, and 9 if it was high. So it's kind of like you get one of 3 options. You're a low, you're a medium, you're a high, and it's a 1, 3, then it jumps to 9 scoring for each of those 7 factors. In terms of where will the line be drawn between high and low, you can follow the math. You can say there are 7 questions, here are the range of scores. FDA did not come out and say, here's where that line is. Here's the line that would differentiate what's on the high-risk list from those that are not on that list. So is it a score, just a number score? We've got a range of 7 or even a little less, up to 63. Is it a 50? Is it a 55? What gets you on that list? Is it a percent? The top 25% are going to be considered high risk. FDA really didn't give any indication of how they're going to use these scores in determining what a high-risk food actually is.
Still a lot kind of up in the air there. David, let's come back to you. Is FDA going to do this analysis that Jennifer was just speaking to for every single food product? And if they're going to do that, where are they going to get the data?
Well, yeah, good question. There's no way that the agency can do this for every single food product. As Jennifer's gone over in the previous answers, they're looking at a lot of parameters, and I just don't see how they can do this for every single food product. I do see them trying to bunch food products, commodities together in the context of risk profiles. So I think that there's going to be there's going to be buckets of food, so to speak, that will be put together in terms of the higher risk and the non-higher risk. Be interesting to see how they actually navigate through this. And in terms of where they're going to get the data, well, again, as Jennifer has said, they're wanting to look at a whole lot of parameters. And in terms of the parameters that the regulators are looking at, I think they're good parameters. But let's face it, the data available on many of them is really, really thin, and that's going to be a challenge. It's going to be a real challenge. And it sort of floats us back to the perennial problem is that often the private sector has data that would help inform the agency, but there is this reluctance to share it, particularly if you would voluntarily share data that might tip the food that you make into the high-risk category. Who would want to do that? So the incentives for producing that data are not exactly robust, to say the least. So I think this is a big challenge. And one of the messages from all of this high-risk food type work is it is absolutely going to be a need to be a work in progress, and I hope that none of it gets set in stone moving forward, because the data is going to change, the information is going to change. What is designated as low risk, high risk will change. Certainly, as we've seen, low risk food becomes high risk food when certain things happen and outbreaks occur in products that we've never seen cause a problem before, or we haven't recognized as being a problem. And everybody on the phone is going to recognize that peanut butter is the classic example of that one over the last 5 or 10 years. So I think this is going to have to be fluid. There is a complete absence of data for much of this stuff, and that's going to be one of our challenges, and no question about it. Which means that they're not going to be able to do it for every single food. So that's the thoughts on that one, Barbara.
It's food for thought, pardon the pun. Jennifer, back to you. Obviously, there are concerns. You're out there a lot speaking about FSMA. What are some of the concerns that have been expressed about this approach?
There are indeed a lot of concerns, and I think that, David mentioned some of them. The first is, how do you even choose with finite resources and limited data what foods you look at? How do you bucket foods, and how do you make sure that an analysis of risk that you've done for one food for which you have data applies to other foods? Considering the differences in just how a food may be processed, the differences in the practices of facilities. So how do you try to consolidate this and make assumptions about foods that are risky without considering all the factors, the different suppliers, the different types of processing that might be available? Very difficult to draw those lines. So there are concerns about that. There are concerns about the availability of data, and also, in some cases, how some of these data will be used. So, for example, looking at outbreaks and looking at illness going back to 1998. Well, things have changed. In some industries, they've changed substantially because of illness, because of outbreaks. Improvements have been made. So it's kind of like you're not really getting credit. If you're in that type of industry, you're not getting credit for the progress that you've made. This also doesn't consider the new regulations that we know are coming down the pike related to FSMA, the preventive controls, allergen control requirements. If we're looking at reportable food registry reports, a lot of them relate to allergen issues. Well, once allergen controls are in place, once the industry comes up to speed, FSMA is fully implemented, is that something that will change? And so one of the main concerns is, how do you get off the list? Even if you're implicated now, you're considered a high-risk food now, is there an opportunity, as things change, as programs improve, to get off the list? Some people feel that some of these factors are interrelated, and so things count more than once. So the economic impact, well, if you've got a lot of outbreaks, there's going to be a higher economic impact, kind of weights things disproportionately, and that the scoring itself, looking at a 1, 3, or a 9, also you kind of get penalized if you've had a couple of questions that maybe aren't going to be answered so favorably for your type of food category. So I think that we really need to see another iteration from FDA, really get into the weeds and start running a couple of example products through this to see, does it make sense? And can we come up with a system that is true to the intent of FSMA and that accomplishes the public health goals, protecting public health and being able to identify these high-risk foods that need these additional record keeping to enable better traceability.
Thank you, Jennifer. So it's a lot to take in. David, back to you. So what are the next steps for FDA on high-risk food methodology, and what should industry start to do now to prepare?
Yeah, the second part of that question, Barbara, is I think where the rubber hits the road on this one. We've been talking for the last 20 minutes about these high-risk food categories and what it means, and Jennifer's given a great overview of how the agency is going to go about trying to put different types of food into high-risk versus non-high-risk groups. But where does this translate down to for the private sector, for the food industry? I mean, what does one need to do differently moving forward? How should you prepare? I think that's really key. So let me attempt to address some of that. I think, as we said earlier, this high-risk, low-risk designation is going to be used for data with regard to product tracking. I think that's inevitable. So if we dissect that down somewhat, and this gets into areas that we've discussed previously on FSMA Fridays around the fact that the agency's authority to expand tracking requirements really hasn't changed significantly, and we're still dealing with the one up, one back, essentially, just as we always were. But the data that is going to be needed to be collected around that is going to be more robust. We're going to need more of it. So I think one of the things that industry should be doing is looking at the data sets they are collecting around the one up, one back, and start to undertake a gap analysis to see where they are in relation to the types of data that would be most likely kept and required for FDA to be compliant if you're high risk. And then looking at it through the lens of somebody in that space saying, well, I make high-risk food and I make low-risk food. How do I manage that? Well, my thinking on that is that you put everything as if it were high-risk. Build a system that is going to be robust irrespective of what FDA does with its high-risk, low-risk. If you have two different systems, it's going to drive you crazy and things won't work out right. That's just the way things are. So build a system that's going to work both ways, and then you're just in good shape. So I think number one, what should the industry do to prepare is begin to look at your product tracking systems. What data are we collecting? Look at what was in the IFT report. Look at some of the recommendations and thoughts that have been put out there in this space in terms of what specifically data should be collected, most likely, and begin to sort of just ask the question, are we there or are we not? I think the second thing is if FDA uses this list or something like it to drive inspections, and they will, I don't think that's going to have people do anything different than they're currently doing. There is going to need to be a compliance with the regulations. It's just a question of how frequent the FDA shows up, and whether they're showing up once every 3 years or once every 5 years. You still need to be compliant. So that doesn't impact it specifically. I think the one thing that I mentioned earlier that is very hard to know how industry should prepare is around the certification for high-risk foods. So let me speculate for a second on that one, Barbara. If you just through, quote, common sense, close quote, you look at the foods that you are importing or your ingredients that you're importing and you're thinking, oh, yeah, you know, these are going to be designated high risk. There's really pretty little doubt that they will be designated high risk. Then I think what the criteria will be for gaining that certification will be criteria around, is that food being produced to the standards that FDA expects as part of FSMA? So if you are importing a high-risk product, or what we think will be high risk, then it's going to be important for you to pay attention to your foreign suppliers. It's going to be important to make sure that they are understanding the need to be compliant with FSMA, preventive control rules particularly, produce rules particularly. So while we don't have full granularity and specificity on those rules yet, that's an area where I think members of the food world who are importing products should look at it through that lens and say, you know, in 2016, 2017, I'm going to have a certificate on this stuff. What does that mean? That means that my foreign supplier is going to have to understand FSMA. They are going to have to understand how to make food safety plans and follow produce rules. And I mean, we've talked about these rules before in terms of some of them are pretty solid already and some of them are fairly loose. But that is definitely something that I think the industry can do to prepare for what this list may do to us as it begins to gain shape. So two main things probably. One is the product tracking that I talked about. Begin to look at that, and the second is look at your list of imported ingredients through the lens of, yeah, this one would be high on the likelihood of requiring a certificate. Let me make sure that those foreign suppliers I'm buying from understand that they are going to have to up their game and be compliant with these new laws. So that's where I would take it. In terms of the next steps for FDA, I think as Jennifer said, they're trying to gather data and put something together on this that will provide some level of robustness, but again, as Jennifer says, you know, we've got to have some flexibility in here, and I too am very, very bothered about the fact that this may be like a one-way valve, that you can only go from low risk to high risk, and you can never go from high risk to low risk, and that would be disappointing in all kinds of ways, because it, to me, it detracts from the push to become to seek progressive improvement and reward good behavior. And even in the context of a food that is designated as high risk, is, well, I put these 3 mitigations in place. Can you now designate my production of that food as low risk? That's a nuance which I can probably just dream about and will never happen. But I do worry that this will essentially be a one-way pipe, and you can only go into the high-risk bucket and you'll never come out. And if that's the case, then it isn't ultimately going to serve much purpose moving forward. So that's my thoughts on next steps, Barbara, along with a couple of editorial and opinions on top of it. So
well,
back to you.
Take in. It is a lot to take in. We're going to go out of full screen now to get some questions from our audience. While we wait for some of those to come in, let me give everybody some information. We have now announced the schedule of FSMA Fridays till the end of the year. You see that in August and September, we've got a Part 1 and Part 2 to go over the second review cycles of the produce, human, and animal rules. If those aren't out, we'll juggle our schedule as we often do. In October on Halloween, so don't get scared by this topic, but you know, a lot of people have been asking us to talk about how GFSI schemes align with FSMA. Where is their alignment? Where's their gaps? And we're going to be discussing that. In November, there are things that we're waiting to see what FDA is going to do. There are other things in FSMA that we know are not going to go away. They were in the first round, they're going to be in the second round, and they're going to be in the final rules. And we're going to really focus that day on what you should do to prepare now. And of course, in December, we're going to have the team look at what we can expect for FSMA in 2015. If you have anybody that would like to register or you'd like to tell about FSMA Fridays, they can register at FSMAFridays.com. And we announced last month our GFSI Leadership Series, SQF, FSSC, and BRC, The Road Ahead. This is a three-part series. Almost 800 food safety folks have signed up for this so far, and you can register off of the home page at SafetyChain.com, and we've got our websites there for more information from SafetyChain and the Atchison Group. And with that, let's get to some questions. I'm going to start with a couple of questions from Carrie, who emailed those to us this week because she was only able to dial in today. So, David, I'm going to give you this first one. Do you think FSMA will still include regulations on irrigation water, such as E. coli?
Yes, I do. I think there's been a ton of debate on this one, Barbara, around whether the agency will require standards for water being used for produce. I believe they will. I think there's great debate about what's the right marker, whether it should be E. coli or something else. And I think that debate will continue. But the answer to the question, do I think it'll ultimately be in the final rule? Yeah, I do. I think water safety is a big part of good agricultural practices, and the FDA has to have some yardstick to measure it by. And right now, while not optimal, this may be the best one. So I think it'll be.
Second question that was submitted by Carrie. Let's see, I'll stick with you on this, David. Do you think FSMA will also still require salmonella and listeria testing of produce? And if so, will the method still require PCR analysis, or will ELISA testing approved be sufficient?
Okay, that's an interesting question. I think there's a bit of a crossed wire on that one. The proposed produce rule doesn't require testing of produce for listeria or salmonella, I think you said were the two things. So there is no product testing requirements per se in the proposed rules. So I think that that's not in there right now, and I don't see that it will come in such a prescriptive way. I think we need to be aware that the final rules may have some sort of finished product testing requirement in them. The proposed rules didn't, as again everybody likely on the call today is aware that the agency was given the authority to require finished product testing and had some of that in the very early versions, but it was taken out by OMB for economic reasons. I think there is some desire to put some part of that back in, possibly for certain types of food in certain types of facilities. So I think we just need to keep an open mind on that one. With regard to the second part of that question, around testing methodologies and labs, if the agency requires it, you'd be smart to be using an appropriate methodology with an appropriately accredited lab. And if you didn't, then I don't think they would regard the data as being robust. So this is right now, it is not a proposed requirement, but it may come in as we start to see these rules become final, Barbara.
Okay. Thank you, David. Jennifer, we've got a question from Dan, and I should mention to everybody that if you're online, and we're out of full screen now, so to submit a question, you can just go to that box in the lower right-hand side, enter it, and hit send. Jennifer, Dan is asking, how will the new high-risk classification differently impact FDA regulations on these foods?
Well, that's a good question. FSMA there are many regulations that FDA is in the process of writing and now finalizing related to FSMA, some of which could have, some of them are directly related to this high-risk foods traceability in particular, and FDA has not issued a proposed rule, but when the agency does, according to FSMA, that rule will apply only to these foods that have been designated as high risk. So that's a very clear relationship between who's going to be on this list and the impact of that rule in particular. When we look at some of the other rules, for example, preventive controls, there's not as proposed, there's not an indication from FDA that if you're high risk, you need to do this. If you're not high risk, you need to do that. Every facility needs to analyze for the foods that they're producing, what are the hazards and how do they control them. Now, would I recommend that a facility look at this list and think about whether or not the agency has classified the food they're producing as high risk and factor that into their equation as they're looking at the risks and looking at the controls? Yeah, absolutely. But that's kind of an indirect way of applying this high-risk foods list, this high-risk foods designation to the rules. With the exception of traceability, and if you look at the high-risk methodology, they say this is for traceability, this is for the additional record-keeping requirement, that's why we're doing this. So outside of that, there's no clear tie to the other rules, but still I think a prudent facility, a prudent company would consider how other people are viewing their foods when thinking about how to control them. And as we look at foreign supplier verification, they need to evaluate the safety, the risks associated with the imports they're bringing in. They probably want to look at this too, and then that ties into what David was talking about down the line. Will those foods require an official certification because the agency has designated them as high risk? But that's something that I think we need to keep in the back of our head, but we just don't have anything from the agency right now that would confirm that indeed high-risk foods that come out of this analysis, that there will be any rules that apply to them directly other than one related to traceability, which hasn't come out yet. And David, I don't know if you see things any differently.
No, I don't. No, I think you're exactly right. I think there is that direct impact, and then there's these other areas that I talked about that have that somewhat more indirect impact.
Thank you, Jennifer. David, a question from Jose. He's saying, as of now, what we do to prevent foodborne hazard is to identify them and analyze their risk based on severity and likelihood. Is this not the approach FDA will use then to determine high-risk food?
Yeah, no, it is the approach. I think the person asking the question has boiled it down to the essence of what one determines to be risky. What Jennifer pointed out earlier in some of the responses that she gave, the agency is trying to drive that into a set of metrics. So they're trying to apply scores to some degree to that sort of analytic approach. And yeah, they're looking a little bit more broadly perhaps, but ultimately trying to drive this to a metric-based system so that they can rank foods or food groups or food commodities in a way that will allow them to determine high risk versus low risk. But in principle, no, it's the same thing. We've all of us been having this thoughts of is this a high risk situation or a low risk situation? You do it every day. You probably do it multiple times every day, either within a plant or when you're starting up a new product line or adding a new ingredient or doing something. You know, if you're smart, you're thinking, have I changed my risk profile? And if I have, am I acting accordingly, and am I controlling that risk? I mean, that's the essence of what we try to do every single day of our lives with regard to producing safe food. So I think the questioner has it pretty much wrapped up. Jennifer, what do you think? I mean, I think it's a succinct summary of where this is trying to go, but the agency, I suspect, is trying to drive it into more metric-driven thinking.
Yeah, I think I agree with you. At the core, it is still about severity and likelihood, and you can take those 7 factors and you can kind of identify, is this driving the severity side or is this driving the likelihood side? So I think the agencies just framed the questions a little bit differently, broken it out into a few additional questions to support that ultimate, how likely is it to occur? And if this hazard occurs, what's the consequence? How severe is it? So philosophically, I think that the approach proposed by FDA is in alignment with that traditional approach of severity and likelihood. It's just that the questions are phrased a little bit differently.
Great, thank you. We have time for just a couple of additional questions. Let me take a few more here. Jennifer, I'm going to stay with you for a question from Robert. Robert's asking, if FDA is collecting data to address high-risk foods, how are they collecting that data and what sources are they using?
Well, as of right now, I think that it would be a little premature for FDA to go out and be actively collecting data specifically for this purpose, because the methodology that was put out there was proposed. It's not finalized. The agency was seeking comment on it and is in the process of evaluating those comments now, and so there's a chance that this method might change, the data needs might change, so it would be premature for FDA to be putting resources towards collecting data. That said, some of these data are collected just on a regular basis by the agencies, FDA and partner agencies, CDC, for example, related to some of the health data. So there are sources of data out there, and FDA from time to time has undertaken special projects to evaluate risk associated with particular food products. So recently they did a spice risk profile. They're in the process of looking at tree nuts and doing a risk assessment. So for some limited types of food products, they may have more data just at the ready compared to other products, but I doubt that they're actively obtaining new data right now. At the point that the methodology is finalized, I would expect the agency to submit a call for data, asking for the industry, academics, all stakeholders to provide data to fill in whatever those blanks are that we finally settle upon.
Yeah, it's as you said, there's a lot there. I'm going to take one last question. I love this question. I'm going to give this to you, David. This is from Ed. Do you foresee the media reacting differently when there is a recall on a high-risk food? Do you think they'll blow it out of proportion because that food is labeled high risk?
Oh, that's a great question. No, I don't. I don't see the media reacting differently just because a food is labeled as high risk. What drives the media to react to the situation is not so much whether it's a food that is determined to be a high risk or a low risk food. I mean, as we all know, there are many other factors and facets that drive media attention on food, everything from slow news days to literally body counts, and that's the sorts of things that drive the news media to talk about one recall over another. So I don't think whether you're on the high risk list would have an impact during the recall. However, this question from Ed does raise a very a parallel and interesting point, is that if and when the FDA publish a list of high-risk foods, what will the media do with that list? No, I mean, completely separate from a recall. It's just like, okay, here's the high-risk list from FDA. I mean, we see this on a regular basis when consumer organizations come out with different lists of risky food from various angles and parameters of what they perceive as risky foods, and the media jump all over that for a couple of days. So I'm a little concerned around what the media might do with this list of high-risk foods and the impact it could have on sectors of the food industry. And as an industry as a whole, we need to be prepared to manage that. So I think Ed raises a really interesting point. I don't believe it'll impact recalls, but it could have kickback through media when this list is ultimately published, and particularly depending on how FDA go about it. And it becomes a regular news feature of, oh, such and such a commodity has now jumped from low risk to high risk. I mean, you can see consumers completely getting the wrong end of that stick and starting to react in all kinds of inappropriate ways around around that angle. So I think we've got to watch out. The media will likely do something with this, and I suspect it may be more on terms of just who's on the list than anything else. So that's a great question, though.
I suspect you're right. Well, I think that's all that we can take for today. Thank you, as always, David and Jennifer, and thanks everybody for joining us today. Happy FSMA Friday, and have a great weekend, everybody.
Thanks, Barbara.
Thank you.